Imagine waking up in the dead of night, the silence of the house broken only by faint creaks and occasional snaps, as if the very air was tense. I was just a child, no more than 8 years old, but I still vividly remember that feeling. The cold sensation that began to crawl over my body the moment I heard the front door slam shut. My parents, I was sure they were home, but why the sudden silence? I lay there, motionless, in the darkness of my room, my ears strained for any sound, any movement, waiting for some word, a sign that my parents were simply taking care of something downstairs. But there were no voices, only the sound of footsteps echoing on the wooden floor, slow and heavy, as if someone was wandering, exploring. Whoever was downstairs didn't seem to care about being quiet. I shrank beneath the covers, my heart pounding as if it were trying to leap out of my chest. I wanted to believe it was just my dad, maybe coming back after forgetting something. But something was off. My dad would never leave the house so quiet. Never. The footsteps continued, and soon I heard the sound of drawers being opened, furniture being dragged. And yet, there was no conversation, no exchange of words, nothing. With every noise, I felt the fear growing, spreading through me like a cold shadow. This wasn't normal. This wasn't my dad. Suddenly, the footsteps changed direction. They were getting closer, heading up the stairs. I clutched the sheet, my eyes fixed on the door. The steps creaked under the weight of whoever was coming. And the worst part? There were no lights, no lamp flickering on to reveal who was ascending, only the darkness and the invisible form approaching. Then the doorknob slowly turned. I was alone. I knew that now. Whoever was in the house wasn't part of my family. The door creaked, opening just enough to let in a motionless figure, a faceless shadow. In the dark, I could barely make out the outline of a head, just watching. And at that moment, I knew something terrible was happening. My lips quivered, and I whispered the names of everyone I could think of. Chris? Mom? Dad? The shadow remained silent. There was no response, only that presence standing there, sensing something. I didn't know what. And then, without warning, the door began to close again, slowly, deliberately. I didn't move. I didn't dare. The door clicked shut, but the sound was deafening to me. I stayed lying there, my body stiff as if trapped in ice, waiting for any sign that it was over. But the silence that followed was almost worse than the footsteps, because I knew, even though the figure had vanished from sight, it was still there somewhere in the house. I heard the muffled sound of footsteps descending the stairs, this time quicker, more determined. My heartbeat matched the rhythm, and all I could think was, who was here? Why were they here? My mind tried to piece together logical answers, but nothing made sense. Everything was wrong. And then, the noises started again. Drawers opening, cabinet doors slamming. I could even hear the refrigerator being opened, as if someone was searching for something, or someone. Every click, every bang echoed through the house, invading the darkness like a warning, a reminder that I wasn't alone. I tried to convince myself that maybe it was just my older brother, Chris. He often came home late, rummaging through the kitchen before heading upstairs to sleep. But there was no explanation for that behavior, for that wordless, faceless presence, just a figure moving as if the house belonged to it. It wasn't Chris. Couldn't be. And the worst part? Those footsteps started climbing again. Slow, heavy, echoing up the stairs like the sound of a coming sentence. Each step closer made me want to scream, to run, but I was frozen. I knew that whoever was climbing wasn't part of my family. I knew that what was coming for me. The sound grew louder, closer. My room, dark and suffocating, seemed to shrink as the steps reached the top of the stairs. Then my door creaked again. That same presence, that same shadow was there, only this time I couldn't breathe. I saw the outline in the doorway standing still. It made no sound. It didn't move, just watched. I didn't know if it could see, but I felt the weight of its gaze. And in that moment, one thing became clear. Whatever it was, it hadn't left. And it had no intention of leaving anytime soon. The door stayed slightly ajar for what felt like eternal seconds, and then, just like before, it slowly closed. The sound of the wood fitting into place was like a final sentence, a warning. I lay there, motionless, trying to steady my breathing. Every beat of my heart echoed in my ears. Silence took over the house again, but the fear had already settled deep within me. Once more, I heard the footsteps descending the stairs. The same steady, heavy rhythm. But this time, something was different. The terror I felt no longer allowed me to ignore the truth. It wasn't my dad. It wasn't Chris. I knew that now. Whoever was in the house didn't belong there. The silence lingered for a while, thick and suffocating. And then, downstairs, the front door opened. A sudden sound, the knob turning, the door swinging wide open. And soon after, the sound of voices. I recognized my mother's voice immediately. It was a relief that almost made me collapse. She and my father were finally home. But the relief didn't last. Reality hit hard. Who had been downstairs before? If my parents had only just arrived, then who was it? I slid slowly out of bed, the fear still pulsing in my veins, but curiosity and the need to know what was happening overtook me. I approached the door, trying not to make a sound. My heart was beating so fast I could barely hear anything else. I reached the top of the stairs and saw my parents standing in the entryway, confused, agitated. They were talking to each other, clearly worried. My dad had his phone in hand, speaking in a low voice, and my mother looked at him, her face tense with worry. I didn't know what had happened, but something was wrong. I called out to them, my voice trembling a little. They looked up at me, shocked to see me awake. My mother rushed up the stairs, her eyes wide with concern. "What are you doing up?" she asked, her voice hurried. "You should be asleep." I hesitated for a moment, unsure how to explain what I saw. I heard someone was here, in my room. My mother's face went pale. She looked at my father, who now stared back at me, eyes filled with shock. They hadn't been home for hours. My father immediately dropped the phone and quickly ascended the stairs, his face serious. The worry in his eyes made me feel even more vulnerable. I tried to explain. "I heard someone walking through the house. They were on the stairs. They came into my room. I thought it was you. But I knew something terrible had happened, something they weren't ready to hear." My mother stood beside me, wrapping her arms around me, while my father grabbed the gun he kept in the bedroom dresser. He went downstairs slowly, cautiously, checking every corner of the house. The sound of his heavy breathing was the only thing breaking the silence. My mother stayed there, clinging to me, her eyes locked on the bedroom door. I could feel her fear. A few minutes passed, minutes that felt like hours. I could hear my father moving things around downstairs, opening doors, checking every room. Every sound made my heart leap. The silence that followed each noise was even worse. It was like we were waiting for something horrible to happen at any moment. Finally, he returned, his face stiff. "The house is empty," he said, but his voice didn't carry any relief. It was filled with tension, as if he didn't fully believe his own words. My mother stayed silent for a moment. Then, as if a light bulb went off in her mind, she began shouting at my father, "You didn't lock the door when we left. You didn't lock the damn door." I saw the fear in his eyes. He had no answer. His expression was a mix of guilt and confusion. All he could do was shake his head, realizing she was right. In the rush to leave, to hurry to the hospital to see Chris, he had left the door unlocked. That's when it hit me. Whoever had been in the house wasn't family, and they had entered without any effort. They had been inside my room, just steps away from me. While I lay there, vulnerable and innocent, I tried to tell my parents about the figure I saw in the dark, about the footsteps on the stairs, about the deep voice that told me to go back to bed. But before I could say everything, my father was already on the phone, calling the police. I wanted to believe it was all over, that whoever it was had gone. But the fear lingered, deeply rooted in my chest. I knew something very wrong had happened. I wasn't safe, and somehow I had the feeling I never would be again. The next few minutes were a blur of hurried voices and suffocating tension. The police arrived quickly, the red and blue lights flashing through the windows, casting a menacing glow on the hallway walls. The officers walked through the house, retracing the steps the intruder had taken moments earlier. They started asking questions, their voices low and serious, while my father tried to explain, still burdened with guilt. When it was my turn to explain what I saw, the words came out hesitant, trembling. I spoke about the footsteps, about the shadow that appeared in my doorway, about the deep voice that told me to go back to bed. The way the officer looked at me, he believed me, but something in his eyes told me he also knew it was too late. As he took notes, my mother paced back and forth, visibly agitated, whispering with my father. They felt responsible. They knew that by rushing out, they had left me vulnerable, at the mercy of whoever had entered that night. The guilt weighed on them. After searching the house one last time, the officers came back to us with the same empty answers. No evidence, no clear sign of a break-in, nothing had been stolen. Maybe whoever entered wasn't here to hurt anyone, one of the officers suggested, but the tone of his voice said otherwise. He was trying to comfort us, but there was no solace in his words. The stranger who had been in my house that night hadn't taken anything. But what did they really want? The answer eluded me, and the mystery hung over all of us, heavy like a shadow. When the police finally left, giving instructions to lock all doors and windows, the expected relief never came. My parents tried to smile, tried to convince me that everything was under control now, that I was safe. But even as they spoke, I could see the panic in my mother's eyes, the tension in my father's hands. I went to bed, but I knew I wouldn't sleep, because even though no one had hurt me, the very idea of a complete stranger walking through my house, standing in my room, watching in silence, was worse than any nightmare. There were no marks, no signs of an invasion, but the fear they left behind. That fear had settled deep, and I knew it would stay with me. I had no answers. I didn't know who that stranger was, what they wanted, or why they had simply left. But something told me that, even though the door was locked now, the real danger had never left. It was still there, somewhere, lurking in the shadows of my mind, waiting to come back and haunt me again. It all started innocently enough, almost insignificantly, like a small piece of a puzzle I couldn't yet see in full. My younger brother, about 7 or 8 years old, was your typical kid obsessed with superheroes, especially Batman. He had this Batman car, a toy that, when you pressed a button, made noises and lit up. It was his favorite, and not a day went by without him carrying it around the house, the sounds echoing through the halls. It was on some random afternoon, when he came back inside from the yard, that things started to get strange. He walked through the kitchen door, holding something in his hands, a proud, innocent smile on his face. My mom and I barely paid attention until he said, excitedly, "Look what I found!" He was holding a photo, one of those school pictures kids get taken, with the blue background and the school name printed at the bottom. But this photo, it was worn, dirty. Time and neglect had blurred the face in the image so much that it was hard to make out the details. A boy, that much was clear. But who? The date on the photo had been rubbed away by time, making it impossible to know what year it was from. My mom looked at it without much concern. Probably some neighbor lost it in the yard, she said, dismissing it. But then my brother said something that sent a chill down my spine. This is Buddy, he said with a simple smile. My friend. I looked at him, confused. Buddy? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Who's Buddy? He pointed at the picture again, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. This guy. He's my friend. That made me uncomfortable. My brother never had many friends. In fact, he was always kind of a loner, and he hadn't mentioned any new friends since we moved into that house. And now, all of a sudden, he had a friend? And where the hell did this old, deteriorated photo come from? I tried to ignore the chill creeping up my spine, convincing myself it was just the wild imagination of a kid. He probably made up this Buddy. It wasn't unusual for children to have imaginary friends, right? But there was something about the way he held that photo so carefully, like it was more than just some childish invention. It was as if Buddy was real to him, and that started to bother me in a way I couldn't explain. In the days that followed, the unsettling feeling that something was wrong began to grow. My brother wouldn't stop talking about Buddy. Every time he mentioned that name, a shiver ran down my spine. But what really started to scare me were the noises. Noises that shouldn't have been happening. It was always at night, when the house was quiet and everyone was asleep, that the Batman car, my brother's favorite toy, would start making sounds by itself. At first, I thought he was just leaving the toy on before going to bed. After all, kids are careless with that sort of thing, right? But that wasn't it. One night, around 3 in the morning, I was woken up by the familiar sounds of the car, that electronic hum, the sound of tires speeding up. But something was different this time. The sound was constant, unending. Annoyed, I got out of bed and went to my brother's room to scold him. I thought he was awake, playing with the toy, but when I entered his room, I found him fast asleep, the Batman car lying on the floor, across the room. Yet the toy kept making noise, its lights flashing in the dark. I frowned, kneeling to pick up the car and turn it off. When I reached for it, my hands were cold with nervousness. I pressed the button to switch it off, and finally, silence returned to the room. I looked at my brother, who was still sleeping peacefully, as if nothing was wrong. But as I stared at him, something in my mind didn't add up. That toy, it only worked if someone pressed the button. I went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. The noise from the toy, the way it kept running on its own, it stayed in my head. And then, the next night, it happened again. The Batman car started making its sounds, by itself, as if someone was playing with it. And every time I went to check, my brother was sound asleep, not touching the toy. Each night, the sounds seemed to grow more persistent, more disturbing. I started avoiding my brother's room at night, hoping the noise would stop on its own. But what really started to terrify me was when my brother, his eyes sleepy, would wake up in the middle of the night and mumble, "Buddy wants to play. Buddy. Always Buddy." With each passing night, the name of that invisible friend seemed to grow like a shadow over us. And with it, the persistent sound of that toy, somehow coming to life on its own. The next morning, my mom started noticing something strange about my brother's behavior. He was talking more and more to this Buddy, as if he were a real person. It wasn't just the occasional mention of an imaginary friend anymore. Now, he had long conversations with him during the day, and the most disturbing part, also at night. Once, when I went into his room, I found him sitting upright in bed, as if he was really talking to someone. He was murmuring things, fragmented sentences, like he was responding to a voice I couldn't hear. I got closer, a chill creeping up my spine, and asked, "Who are you talking to?" He just slowly turned his head, and in the most natural voice, said, "Buddy, he's right here." I froze. I looked at the empty space beside the bed, but there was nothing there. At least nothing I could see. The air felt colder, heavier. It was like something was actually there, watching. "Buddy wants to play," he continued, smiling as if everything was normal. But it wasn't. The way he spoke about Buddy as if he were talking to someone present, it was different. It was more than just an imaginary friend. I tried to brush off the discomfort with a nervous smile and said, "All right, but it's late. You need to go to sleep." My brother hesitated for a second, as if he was listening to someone's response. And then, in a serious tone, he said, "Buddy said I don't have to. He wants me to stay up with him tonight." That was enough to make me tense up. I backed out of the room and returned to my bed, trying to ignore the growing unease. But as I lay there in the dark, I couldn't shake the way he talked to Buddy. It didn't feel like a game. Felt too real. And then, of course, the sound came again. The damn Batman car started making noise out of nowhere, its mechanical sounds filling the silence of the house. This time, I didn't go check. I didn't want to see. But no matter how much I tried to ignore it, the name Buddy kept echoing throughout the house. My brother talked about him during breakfast, while playing, even at bedtime. And every night, the same scene repeated. He'd sit on his bed, talking to that empty space next to him, as if he were interacting with someone I could never see. The worst part, I started to believe that Buddy was actually there, watching us the whole time. The nights became unbearable. It wasn't just the sound of the Batman car activating on its own. It was the feeling of something else, something invisible but present. My brother talked more and more with Buddy, and his behavior grew stranger by the day. Even my parents began to notice that something was off. We all tried to ignore it, but fear hung over us like a dark cloud. One night, while I was trying to sleep, I heard that familiar sound again. The damn Batman car, its lights flashing and mechanical sounds echoing down the hall. But this time, the sound was different, closer. And then, without warning, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The toy was moving. Eyes wide, I slowly turned my head toward the door of my room, and there it was. The Batman car rolling into my room, coming from the dark hallway. No one was there to push it. It just came. I screamed, the fear finally escaping from my throat. In a panic, I ran to my parents' room, my heart pounding like it was going to explode out of my chest. My sister, who had been sleeping in my room that night, ran with me. The terror on her face mirrored exactly what I felt. "It's Buddy," I sobbed, the words barely coming out. "It's him. He's playing with the toy." My parents, still confused, tried to calm us down. They were irritated, thinking it was just a childish prank, a silly fear. But when we explained what we saw, something in their expressions changed. My mom gave my dad a look, and he got up, visibly concerned. We all went to my brother's room. The Batman car was still there, now sitting motionless in the middle of the hallway, as if nothing had happened. My dad entered the room, his face hard, and looked at my brother, who was sitting up in bed, half asleep. "Were you playing with the car?" he asked, his voice firm. My brother shook his head slowly, his eyes still groggy. "It wasn't me," he said. "It was Buddy. He wanted to play." Those words, they've never left my mind. They echoed in the room like a whisper, as if they hadn't just come from my brother's mouth, but from something darker, something lurking in the silence. That night, the decision was made. My dad grabbed the Batman car, removed the batteries, and threw the toy in the trash. The house fell into a heavy silence, all of us trapped in a state of dread and uncertainty. But what no one wanted to say out loud, what we all felt, was that the problem wasn't the toy. It never had been. Something far more unsettling was with us, and somehow my brother had brought it into our lives. I knew, at that moment, that Buddy wasn't just an imaginary friend, and whatever it wasn't going to leave easily. For a few days, it seemed like it was over. The toy was destroyed, the batteries removed, and my father, always the skeptic, insisted that everything would return to normal. For a while, the house was quiet. There were no more noises at night, no disturbing sounds from the Batman car. It was like the house had gone back to its natural rhythm. We, especially my sister and I, finally began to relax. It seemed like Buddy was gone, taken away along with the toy, but deep down something still bothered me. The way my brother talked about Buddy. The certainty he had that this friend was real. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling that something was wrong never fully left me. Until that night. We were in the kitchen, my mom cooking something simple on the George Foreman grill while we played in the living room. The atmosphere was calm, almost comfortable, when suddenly, a loud crash shattered the silence. We all jumped, the noise echoing through the house like an explosion. We rushed to the kitchen and found the grill in the middle of the floor. It hadn't just fallen. It had been thrown off the counter, as if someone had pushed it with force. The chicken was scattered across the floor, and the smell of burnt food filled the air. My mom swore she had left the grill far from the edge. There was no reason it should have fallen like that. My parents looked at each other, and for the first time, my dad's skepticism seemed to waver. Something was happening, something that didn't make sense, something that couldn't be explained. My mom went pale, her eyes wide, as if she was finally realizing what I, my sister, and even my brother had already known. And then, to our absolute shock, the next morning, the toy, the damn Batman car that my dad had destroyed and thrown away, was back, completely intact, as if it had never been touched. My dad, filled with anger and confusion, confronted my brother immediately. "Did you take this out of the trash?" he asked, his voice thick with frustration. But my brother, with the calmest expression, responded in a way that made my blood run cold. "It wasn't me," he said, looking straight at my dad. "Buddy brought it back." The words echoed through the house, and in that moment, it became painfully clear that whatever or whoever Buddy was, he was still with us, still watching. The Batman car was destroyed again, this time in pieces so small there was no way it could ever be put back together. But even then, the feeling that something was watching us never went away. We moved about a year later. My parents said it was because of work or that they wanted a bigger house, but deep down I knew the truth. I knew they were trying to escape something no one dared to talk about. But even now, whenever the house is quiet and night falls, I still wonder. I wonder if Buddy ever really left. And if he didn't, where did he go after he was done with us? I was only 10 years old when we moved into that new house. It was a small town, the kind where everyone seems to know each other, and the kids already had their own groups of friends. I was the new kid, and that made everything harder. At school, I was the outsider, the one no one knew, and in those first few weeks, making friends felt impossible. It was one of those days after school, when I was riding my bike around the neighborhood, that I met Dan. He was standing in his yard, watching as I passed by. "Hey, you're the new kid, right?" he asked, walking over to the fence. I nodded, a bit nervous. He seemed friendly enough, so we ended up talking for a while. He told me he went to a private school, which explained why I hadn't seen him before. From then on, we started hanging out, riding our bikes around the block, exploring the area. It was a relief to finally have someone to talk to, someone to pass the time with. A few days later, I met Alex. He showed up at my front door, out of nowhere. He literally rang the bell and asked my parents for me, like we were old friends. When I went to the door, there he was, grinning from ear to ear, saying he lived in the same block and wanted to know if I liked video games. Of course, I said yes. But there was something about Alex, something that didn't seem right from the beginning. He invited me over to his house, which was at the other end of the block, and me, curious and eager to make more friends, agreed. I grabbed my bike and followed him to his place. The first thing I noticed was the condition of his house. It was different. Every other house on the block was well kept, with green lawns and tidy entrances. But Alex's, it looked run down, neglected. There wasn't any grass in the yard, just large patches of dirt. The sidewalk was cracked, and the paint on the house was peeling in places. Something about it already made me uneasy, but I pushed forward, telling myself it was probably just a coincidence. Maybe Alex's family was just different from the others. When I stepped inside, it was worse. The mess was undeniable. Boxes stacked everywhere, old, dirty furniture, and the smell, a strange odor, like the house hadn't been aired out in weeks. Alex led me to the basement where he said he had his video game set up. The basement was in even worse condition. It smelled sour, almost like animals had lived there, but there were no animals in sight. Just filth and the heavy air that made me want to leave as quickly as possible. We sat on an old leather couch and he turned on the video game. As we played Grand Theft Auto, I tried to ignore the growing feeling that something was wrong. Alex seemed so eager to have someone around, almost desperate for company. I wanted to leave, but I didn't want to be rude. We played for a couple of hours until I finally said I had to get home. Alex looked disappointed, insisting that I stay longer. But at that moment, all I wanted was to get out of there. On the way home, Alex walked with me down the street, chatting as if nothing had happened, as if the mess and weirdness of his house were completely normal. But something inside me was screaming to keep my distance. The next day, Alex showed up at my door again. He didn't seem to notice, or maybe he didn't care, that something had been off the night before. My parents, not knowing much about him, just called me to the door like he was any regular friend. I hesitated but ended up agreeing to hang out again. This time he wanted to play video games at my house, and though I didn't want to, I couldn't bring myself to say no directly. There was something about Alex that made me uncomfortable, but at the same time, he was too insistent for me to just push him away. So we sat in my room for about an hour, playing in silence. But every minute that passed, the feeling of discomfort grew. Alex was strange. He sat too close, his eyes glued to the screen, but sometimes I'd catch him looking at me out of the corner of his eye, like he was studying me, analyzing my every move, every word I said. It gave me chills. The silence between us wasn't a comfortable one, the kind you get when you're focused on the game. It was heavy, like there was something hanging in the air, something I couldn't understand. When I finally said I had to do homework, Alex gave me that same disappointed look as before, like he didn't want to leave. "We can keep playing tomorrow," he said, not even waiting for an answer. Then he left through the front door, leaving that strange, unsettling feeling behind. I collapsed on my bed after he left, feeling immediate relief. Alex's presence was disturbing, almost claustrophobic, and no matter how hard I tried not to think about it, something deep in my mind told me he wasn't going to stop coming back. He would return, as always, and I was right. The next day, when I got home from school, my mom told me Alex had come by again. He wanted to know if I could hang out, but I wasn't in the mood this time. I tried to be polite and asked my mom to tell him I was sick, that I couldn't come out, but Alex didn't give up that easily. Later that day, while I was riding my bike around the neighborhood with Dan, we passed by Alex's house, and there he was, standing on the front porch like he had been waiting for me. It was like he knew I was coming by. When I saw him, a chill ran down my spine. He stepped off the porch as soon as he spotted me. His eyes locked onto mine. "You were sick, huh?" he said, his voice carrying a tone that made me shudder. He knew I had lied, and the way he said it, like he was challenging me, made me feel like something was about to go very wrong. Dan looked at me, confused, while I tried to shrug off the conversation. I forced a smile and said I was feeling better now, but Alex kept staring at me in a way that made me more and more uncomfortable. There was something about him I couldn't ignore anymore. He wasn't just a lonely kid. It was more than that. He was getting closer to me in a way that felt wrong, like I was the only thing keeping him connected to the world. It was in that moment I decided I needed to distance myself from Alex. Something told me that if I didn't things were only going to get worse. A few days passed, and I really tried to keep my distance from Alex. Every time he showed up at my house, I made an excuse. I told my mom that if he came again to say I wasn't home, I just didn't want to see him anymore. But at the same time, I felt a constant pressure. It was like he was always nearby, waiting for the right moment to show up. And then something happened that terrified me completely. It was a cold September night, and I was already in bed, ready to sleep. The wind was blowing outside, making the window rattle a bit, and the silence of the house was starting to settle in. I was almost asleep when I felt something strange in the air. It was an uncomfortable sensation, a sudden shift in the atmosphere. I turned in bed, trying to find a better position. When I realized that my window was open, I was certain I had closed it before going to bed. The cold air seeping through made me shiver, and for a moment, I stood there confused, trying to figure out how it was possible. I got out of bed, my bare feet touching the cold floor, and went to the window. Outside, everything was calm, the empty street dimly lit by the streetlights. But before I could close the window, I felt something poke my foot. My heart raced. I jumped back, and when I looked down at the foot of the bed, my blood turned cold. Alex was there, sitting on the floor, leaning against my bed. He looked up at me with a strangely calm expression, almost smiling. "Shoo," he whispered, raising a finger to his lips. "It's just me." I was completely in shock. I couldn't speak. I could barely breathe. Alex. Inside my room? How had he gotten in? My mind was racing in 1,000 directions, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing added up. "My parents were fighting," he continued, his voice soft, as if none of this was out of the ordinary. "I didn't want to stay there, so I climbed up through the window. I just wanted to be with you." A chill ran down my spine. He had climbed through my bedroom window in the middle of the night, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. His gaze was no longer friendly. There was something disturbing about the way he was watching me, as if he were waiting for something from me, as if I were the only person who could calm him down. I wanted to scream, to run to my parents, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear, by the violation of my space. Finally, I managed to speak, my voice weak and trembling. "You need to leave, Alex." He seemed not to understand. "I just wanted to sleep here," he said, almost pleading. "It's okay, right? My parents don't care. They don't even notice." I took a step back, trying to stay calm. "Alex, you can't do this. You need to go now." He hesitated, his eyes locked on mine, and for a second, I thought he might insist. But then, as if something finally broke inside him, he slowly stood up and walked to the window. He gave me one last look, a sad smile on his lips, before disappearing into the darkness, climbing back out. As soon as he was gone, I ran to lock the window, my heart pounding in my chest. I went straight to my parents' room and woke them up, telling them everything that had happened. They were as shocked as I was. My mom hugged me while my dad got dressed quickly and ran out to try and talk to Alex's parents. But the worst part was what my dad told me when he returned. When he knocked on Alex's door, his mother just laughed. She laughed as if the whole situation were a joke. There was no responsibility, no concern. To her, Alex was just a strange kid, and that was normal for them. After that night, something changed in me. The fear didn't leave me, because if Alex had managed to get into my house once, what would stop him from doing it again? The following nights were suffocating. Even with the window locked, I couldn't sleep properly. Every time the wind blew, or I heard distant footsteps outside, my mind went back to that night. The image of Alex sitting at the foot of my bed, as if it were his place, wouldn't leave my mind. I lived in constant fear that he would come back. My parents, after talking to his, didn't seem to believe that anything worse could happen. "He's just a confused boy," my dad said. "You did the right thing by sending him away. He won't try anything again." But I wasn't so sure. The feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. It was like at any moment, I could open my eyes and see him there, watching me through the window or at the door, waiting for another chance to come inside. And then, a few nights later, it happened again. I was lying in bed, trying to convince myself that I was safe when I heard a sound. Knocking. Soft, rhythmic, coming from the window. I turned slowly, feeling my entire body tense up. The blinds were closed, but I knew it was him. The knocking continued, insistent, as if Alex were patiently waiting for me to open the window for him. My breathing sped up, and for a moment, I thought about getting up and confronting him. But fear paralyzed me. I knew that if I got up, if I saw him again, it would mean he would never leave me alone. The knocking lasted what felt like an eternity. I stayed still, holding my breath, praying for him to go away. When it finally stopped, I felt a temporary sense of relief. But the silence that followed was even heavier, more oppressive. It wasn't over, I knew that. I lay there, my heart pounding, until I heard something that made my blood run cold. The window latch moved. He was trying to open it. I squeezed my eyes shut, wishing I were anywhere else, wishing my parents had listened to me. But the sound of the latch rattling continued, slow, methodical, like he was testing my patience, my resolve. Finally, he gave up. The noise stopped, and the silence returned to the room. I didn't move, I didn't dare check if he was still out there. I knew that even if he had physically left, his presence was still with me, rooted in the fear that grew stronger every night. The next morning, I told my parents what happened. My mom tried to comfort me, saying maybe I had dreamed it. But I knew it wasn't a dream. My dad, though more skeptical, began to take the situation a bit more seriously. He secured the window with more locks, added an extra latch, as if that could keep out what was coming. But that night, as I lay in bed, feeling the weight of the darkness around me, I realized that locking windows and doors wasn't enough. Alex wasn't just trying to get into my house. He was getting into my mind, and more, I felt like I was losing control. I knew he would come back. The only question was when. I barely slept. Every night became a silent torture, waiting for the sound of knocking, the scrape of something against the window. My mind was filled with endless possibilities, with fears that only seemed to grow with each passing day. My dad locked the window again, and I was grateful for that, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't be enough. And then, on the last night I saw Alex, everything changed. It was late, and I had fallen into that light sleep, the kind where you never really rest because you're always waiting for something to happen. Suddenly, I was jolted awake by a different sound this time, louder, more terrifying. The sound of breaking glass. The noise was so unexpected that I screamed, sitting upright in bed, my heart racing. I looked over at the window, the glass shattered, shards scattered across the floor, and through the blinds, I could see Alex's figure climbing through the broken window. He was actually doing it. He was breaking in. I could hardly breathe. The fear was so intense that it froze me for a few seconds. But when I finally moved, I ran out of my room, straight to my parents' bedroom. He broke the window. He's inside. The words tumbled out, my voice shaking. My dad jumped out of bed, already knowing what it was about. He told me to stay with my mom while he grabbed something, a heavy tool, a wrench, and ran down the hall to my room. I heard his heavy footsteps pounding down the corridor, and then nothing. Silence. I sat on the bed with my mom, holding her tight, waiting, not knowing what would happen next. It felt like an eternity before my dad returned, breathing heavily, his face twisted with anger and frustration. "He's gone," was all he said, clenching his fist at his side. Alex had escaped through the same broken window, running down the street before my dad could catch him. That was the last time I saw Alex. After that night, my parents took action. They spoke with the police, who finally stepped in. They paid a visit to Alex's parents, and after that, something shifted. Alex didn't show up again. There were no more knocks on the window, no more attempts to get inside. It was as if he had just vanished. Months later, I found out that Alex's family had moved. Where? No one knew for sure. But while the neighborhood returned to its normal rhythm and life moved on, I couldn't shake that last night from my mind. The sound of the glass shattering, the look in Alex's eyes as he climbed through the window, that feeling that he would have done anything to stay close to me. It stayed with me. I couldn't stop wondering, what would he have done if he'd fully gotten inside? And worse, what could he have done if I hadn't run in time? Years have passed, and I never heard from him again. But every now and then, when I pass a house that looks like the one he lived in, or when I feel a cold wind against the window at night, I can't help but wonder, what kind of person has Alex become?